Good evening. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young, and I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, California. 25 years ago, Alan Jones started the Forum, and tonight we're celebrating that anniversary. At this decisive time in our country, when civil discourse is more needed than ever, we couldn't think of any way we'd rather spend the eve of the election than talking about faith and politics, bridging the divides that separate us, the pandemic, and Alan's hopes for the years ahead. Alan, now Dean Emeritus, was the Dean from 1985 until January 2009. He's a prolific writer as well as a prominent lecturer. And I always say, you're one of the most powerful preaching voices of your generation. People don't usually write that in your bio, but you should add that, Alan. Thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this so much because there's so many times when I think back to what the Forum was. We start so many new things at Grace Cathedral, and some are able to have lives, and some are just experiments that are kind of passing experiments. And I wonder what it felt like when you were planning the Forum. Like, what did you expect it would be? Did you have any idea that would last as long as it did? And how is it different than you were expecting it to be?
Well, actually, I feel a little sheepish in that I didn't invent it at all. It's my way of thinking about Anglicanism and being a Christian, but it's part of a conversation. There's a translation of the fourth gospel: in the beginning was the conversation. And to try and set something up where we have an open view of what it is to be an Anglican, which is very confusing to some people. And I try and explain that as I was growing up in England, I could go through the whole ecumenical movement without leaving the Church of England. So what an Anglican is very complicated. And I love the old slogan, "You have questions, we have questions." But it doesn't come up with answers. It's continually open, and it's always a dialectical reality that no one has the last word, and we're open to this. So a forum is much better than a lecture.
Right, and I love that idea too.
How it started off, really.
Yeah.
As a way of trying to do some education where the only time available to us, because people didn't come out during the week in those days, was to do something between the two big services. And that's how the idea of the Forum came up.
What are some of the memorable people that you had on the Forum? I remember having Malcolm Margolin talk about the Ohlone Way. I remember reading it when I was like 20 years old, and then interviewing him on the Forum. It felt like such a magical time to do that. Rebecca Solnit, I've read her books for decades, and to have her on was just a thrill.
Having people with books, people like Robert Reich and Jane Goodall, of course, came several times and became a good friend. Yeah. So it was a remarkable. Now, who was the last governor of Hong Kong, the British governor?
Oh, right.
Anyway, he was a guest too, and we had politicians, and we had artists and musicians and so on. So it was always a lively conversation. And sometimes we'd have 40 people and sometimes 400 people, depending on the guest.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The guest it's all about the guest. A good guest can really bring a lot of people.
Right.
Were there any disasters or times things went wrong for you at the Forum, or that you remember?
I'm laughing is that I had to shout at somebody whose first question was, "Why isn't there free parking?" And I blew it. I went berserk. Saying,
oh my gosh, yeah.
They didn't do that again. That's why we began to have written questions rather than people spontaneously getting up and making a speech.
That's one of my favorite parts of it, because there is a way in which I think whenever there's a microphone involved, it's hard for people to just boil down their question to a simple, and also not to just have it just be an endless comment. So it is nice having those questions, because it introduces a dynamism. People ask questions that I wouldn't think of, and yet at the same time, you don't derail the conversation by having too much of that.
There was an old phrase when I was growing up. I forget whoever said it. It's sarcastic, saying the lovely thing about Anglicanism is that no one would mistake Anglicans for Christians, which is both an insult and a compliment.
Yeah.
In the fact that our view of Christianity is radically open and welcomes everybody. I love when I use the analogy of Queen Elizabeth I, who, having gone through all sorts of controversy with her father and her mother, basically said, "I don't care what you believe, but please use this book." And why the Book of Common Prayer was so important for uniting people, because they disagreed on almost everything else.
Right. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the church of your childhood, because you're right. I mean, there's a way in which we're in such a polarized time. It's almost hard for a church that, values that mediating role so much, almost like it's a special challenge for a church like ours in a time like this. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yes, it had the monarchy, which is a strange institution in England.
But yes, the monarchy, England.
The fact that I went to, it wasn't a low church Sunday school, it was subterranean church, it was so low. And then I graduated from that to a very good intellectual evangelical church with a great church choir, and God did a lot of church music. And then I met an Anglican monk and fell in love with Anglo-Catholicism, and all within the same church.
Yeah.
And I'm very grateful, for example, even though I'm more in the Catholic side of things, it was a wealthy evangelical family who were kind to me and introduced me to the generous vision of Jesus. And so I'm grateful to the evangelical tradition too. So I'm all over the map when it comes to my faith and my journey.
There've been so many times I think of, in the academic tradition, there's your Dr. Vater, you're the person who influenced you in your academic research. But I hadn't thought very much about who are those voices in preaching for you. And this is the first time I ever thought to myself, gosh, I wonder if that evangelical experience as a child had an influence on you as a preacher. Maybe you could talk a little bit about influences on your preaching, how you got to preach the way that you do.
I think imitating English preachers, I mean, listening to them, they had a sort of formula. They always had 3 points, and came to a conclusion, and perhaps too many quotations. But I was very touched by Norman Hook, for example, who was our vicar in South London, who became Dean of Norwich in England, was a wonderful preacher and an evangelical of the best kind. And he influenced me a great deal with his preparation. He just didn't just get up and sound off. He'd obviously prepared and thought things through and didn't use any notes at all. Wonderful.
Bill Burrell was my rector when I was a child in Davis. And I think, just for those few years, I saw how hard he was working to present something that was excellent. And I know that he influences what I do every single week.
It has its weaknesses because, as I said, Anglicanism can be the bland leading the bland, as someone said, with no bite to it. But it's the one tradition that enables me to continue to call myself a Christian, and that's very important to me. And growing up with it, I treasure it a great deal, even though I can be very critical of it too.
You have such a history with singing too. I wonder if you can talk about just your memories of church as a singer. We're thinking and talking about that all the time now that we can't sing together.
Singing in a church choir, a good church choir, and then singing in Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's Cathedral every year with the St. Matthew Passion and the Messiah, and then being able to sing in the Coronation Choir as a 13-year-old boy. That was a tremendous life-changing thing. And then I was the first of my whole family to ever go to university. So it was a great journey through the church.
Yeah. What was the coronation like? What are your memories of that day?
Oh, just the music and just sitting on top, the way they made seats, tiers of seats. The fact that we sat on top of the orchestra virtually, we could look into the organ loft and see I think it was the BBC Scottish Orchestra and the BBC Symphony, and just being in the middle of all that for 3 or 4 hours was amazing. I think the sad thing I remember was that I was given a meal ticket, a lovely embossed ticket to have at lunch, and I was too frightened to go and get any food because it was surrounded by peers of the realm in their robes and they looked so important. So I never had any food that day until
That's exactly what I would have done too.
a great experience.
Last time I was at Westminster Abbey, I thought about you there as a boy, and just imagine what that must be like.
I think some weakness of Anglicanism comes out in the situation we live now, where if we're going to talk about, for example, civility, we mistake thinking civility means being nice or being polite and not confrontational, whereas actually real civility, there's two words that come to mind. One is a positive word from Italian used by Dante, cortesia, courtesy, meaning not just being polite, but welcoming life, a way of welcoming life, of being positive to it. And the other is the notion of martyrdom, that the only authority a bishop or a priest or anyone in authority has in the end is martyrdom, not necessarily blood martyrdom, but just being available and not in control and being humble. And that's the two aspects of civility that I think we treasure most nowadays, and we need to recover.
Yeah, martyreo is the Greek word to bear witness and to share what it is that you're experiencing. In a way,
that's all you can do.
Yeah, that is all you can do. And I do think that there is a way that you honor somebody by being honest with them.
Right. Father Herbert Kelly, who was the founder of Kellam, the Society of the Sacred Mission, was known as a Bartian before Bart, by the way. I thought I ought to tell you that. He was always talking about the priority of God and God's initiative and and one student finally had the courage to say, well, if God does everything, why do we have to bother?
Right.
And Father Kelly said, well, if you don't bother, you may miss your crucifixion. That would be a pity. Okay. It's very Anglican and sounds very negative, but the notion of transcendence and self-transcendence and surrender and surrendering to God is very, very important.
You know, one of the things I really like about it is the emphasis on ongoing sanctification rather than that moment of conversion. I just going through the same things and making a lot of the same mistakes, but you know, making some progress. You know, that's
what I got from the best of the evangelicals. Is there's the born. Who was it? Walker Percy said in one of his novels, "It's the born again of the twice born. I'm going to wait for the third go round."
Yeah.
In other words, you're not just converted once. It's continual conversion. Continual conversion. You get born again and again and again and again and again. I haven't really got a clue about this religion of mine, but I try and pay attention to it and listen to the stories over and over again. And I'm still struck by the people who are paid at the 11th hour or the Good Samaritan or whatever, but they still come to me with a strikingly new quality of revelation.
Yeah, I love that too. I remember that book. It was the preacher was the preacher of the church without a Christ.
Right.
Yeah. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just your academic work. I've never really asked you what your dissertation was on or what you studied in university. Or
my dissertation was, I wanted to write about F.D. Morris.
Oh yes.
Great 19, and there have been so many PhDs about him that it was Donald Olchin, a great scholar and a great friend in those days, who said, you might study Father Kelly, the founder of Kellam, who was a great disciple of F.D. Morris. So I was even given the title, and it's called it's called Herbert Kelly, Herbert Kelly, The Search for a Credible Catholicism, a Study in Failure. And so it was the beginnings of the questioning of things. He was a very brilliant teacher and founded this Society of the Sacred Mission, which really introduced working class boys into the priesthood.
Yeah.
Up until then, you'd always have to go upper class and be Oxbridge people. And he started this seminary religious order which encouraged working class boys to offer themselves for priesthood.
Yeah.
And so I found him very attractive and went to Nottingham University, which is very close to Kellam, where the mother house was, and I got to know them very well, and that's when I started to write my doctorate. He never wasted paper. He used to write his notes on old margarine paper.
Oh my goodness.
Very eccentric man.
Yes. Wow. You know, I think the first time I probably saw your name was probably when I was a boy, in the church's teaching series.
Oh, right. Yes.
Spirituality. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, because that book is everywhere. Every Episcopal church in the country, used bookstores. It's all over the place. And I wonder if you can talk about how it came into being and what it was like to write that book that had such a huge influence on.
Well, it had to be written several times, and I think it was quite an experience actually, because there was a whole group of people writing different volumes of that series, and then of course after that they wrote a new series. So there's a new series now. So.
But you know, it's Anglican. The new series is not nearly as good as the old one. It's like everything else.
Well, I think so, but
the carpeting isn't as good as the old carpeting, and
that's right. Everything. Yes, there's too much change. Yes.
So you first came to the United States, and what was your impression of the place? Like how? I mean, what did it look like to you when you first arrived, and how things changed over time during this long acquaintance with the United States?
Well, I became a citizen in 1975, but I came as a student 1964 to 68, and then went back to England to teach and did my doctorate 68 to 71, and then 71 to 84 as a seminary professor. And I think it was because I had an English accent and had been trained in the monastic tradition that they thought they needed somebody like me, but I was really far less qualified than most of the other faculty. But they were very tolerant, and I founded the Center for Christian Spirituality at General Seminary in those days, and started people thinking about spiritual direction and what it was to be a spiritual leader. So it was very powerful. And then what I liked about America was it didn't have the class system that the English did. They did have a class system in America, but it's based basically on money, I thought at least. Whereas in England, it would set you where your education was, your parents. The class system was much deeper and stronger than it was in America, or at least the American one, it was more fluid, where you could flow through it much more easily. And that's what attracted me to America. And then after I'd been in America for some time and realized I was going to live there, it made sense to become a citizen.
So how did you, was it, you became a citizen before my mother became a citizen, and how did you decide that? And what was it, what was it like?
I realized I was going to live in America. And I thought, if I'm going to live in America, I want to participate and vote and so on. And what was funny, I mean, I being sworn in Lower Manhattan gives you a whole idea of what it is to be an American. The great genius of America, and I'm very critical of what's going on in America now, but it's an amazing country in that there's no such thing as an ethnically pure American, not even a Native American. But we're all over the map. We're all mongrels. We're all somos todos mestizos.
Yeah.
We're all, and so, whereas I was used to pomp and circumstance in great processions in the Westminster Abbey and St. Paul's Cathedral, in the Lower Manhattan courtroom, there was hardly any dignity at all. And it was during the Nixon period. And we all were given a letter of welcome by the President of the United States, signed Richard Milhous Nixon. And then just before the judge came in to swear us in, functionaries of the court ran up and down the aisles saying, "We need all those Nixon letters back. Anyone need a Ford letter?" It was terrible. And on the other hand, if you looked around at the 2,000 people, or I forget how many people, there was an elegant French woman next to me, and beyond her was an ancient Asian grandfather. There were young people, old people, all over the map ethnically. And the judge came in and was great. He said, "America hasn't happened yet, and you're invited into this great experiment." And I was so impressed by that, and still am impressed by the fact that I know America's falling apart in many ways, but I'm also amazed how well it works, given its history and what it's pioneered to try and do. And it's failing, and it's succeeding, and it's repenting, and it's changing, and it's growing, and it needs work. But here we are, and I'm very, very honored to be an immigrant. I really am.
Yeah. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. Just what do you think is the appeal of Donald Trump? Why do you think he's, for his followers, is such a compelling figure? Like, what makes him work for people who love him?
He's a big bombastic character. And I think the weakness of America is that we aren't always a very sophisticated, educated people. And that sounds very snobby to say that, but I think he appeals to, well, I was going to say something that I shouldn't say in a public thing, but the tendency is that we're a white trash nation with lots of money. And so the idea of America with our founding fathers and mothers was to have mediating institutions of churches, synagogues, universities, libraries, ways that we had an educated, and we may come back to our topic now of having a civic society. And we need to recover that provision of a civic society. We don't have enough to unite us. We're rugged individuals, but our individualism is rancid. It doesn't support we have this truncated, idiotic view of freedom, which means thinking we can do what we damn well please instead of working with, well, I think of Augustine's vision of freedom, two kinds of freedom. One is doing what you damn well please, and the other is doing things according to your true nature.
Right.
And then realizing God has made us as a family and created us neighbors, that in order to exercise our freedom, we have to do it within the structure of a community. Being is communion, and that's the revelation that I stick with and am nurtured by in Anglicanism and in the Christian tradition, and which we find, of course, in all the great religious traditions, that we're in it together.
And we are in it together. In a way, there's been so much very substantial change, and there is kind of a pendulum swinging that is an element to this too. Like we wouldn't have gotten here if we hadn't made some real progress for people to oppose.
But we never arrived. The whole point is that I think the danger is that the liberal side and the conservative side thinks they have the answers, rather than every decision we come to is always provisional. It's never the final answer, because there's always going to be something else that stirs us up. And so
the government can't solve all our problems. Even if it's the most perfect government in the world, we still are.
And we can't solve our problems just by being isolated either, and being cut off. So
it's funny. I when you're talking about those mediating institutions, like for the libraries. I miss libraries so much. I walked into my office at the cathedral, and just the smell of the books, I just miss being in libraries very much.
That was an amazing invention, wasn't it?
Amazing invention, because I love my own personal library, but it's nothing compared to what USF has, for instance.
I do miss some things from Europe. The old European vision of education was for the formation of character, not the building up of information to get a job.
Right.
Not that I think training and so on is important, but the basic thing was the great thing that I loved about my grammar school education was it was totally useless. And that it didn't prepare me for anything except a general way of being a human being. I read the whole of the Shakespeare corpus and studied Shakespeare and went to the theatre a lot, but it didn't sort of train me for anything. And so the whole notion that that it was for, they used to call it the formation of character, rather than, and we have a vision of education which is too practical, I think.
John Donne's biography, I'm reading it right now, and that's exactly what he says, is he keeps being drawn back into humanist learning and languages. And he's frustrated because he wants to enjoy studying law, but he just keeps getting drawn back because he loves the humanities. And that's why I tell people too, here you and I are, we're professional humanities people. Do you know what I mean?
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just the role of a cathedral among all those different institutions. Like what is a cathedral, and what can a cathedral be going forward? How you and I at times said, now is a crucial moment for Grace Cathedral. And I wonder if you can talk, I always, whenever I got invited to do a talk at a club on the role of the cathedral in the modern world. And I was thinking about that paper you wrote about, the cathedral is like these 17 different things.
Right.
But maybe you can talk a little bit about what cathedrals are and what they can do and what their future is.
Well, I think they can become a center for unity across the board that isn't based just on religious affiliation, but it's a way of bringing people together if you like, a funny phrase to use, a sort of a large anthropological experiment where everyone is welcome. We really mean that when we say everyone is welcome, and yet we have a strong liturgy and a strong musical tradition, and at the same time to invite people into this great conversation about what life is about and how we are responsible for and with one another. And that's what a big institution can do. And rather than, it's not that parish churches are important too, but they have a different function of much more local, whereas a cathedral is always reminding people of the larger responsibility, the larger loyalty, the larger vision of what it is to be human. And I think that'll be so great as we go through this crisis. I think cathedrals become more and more important as places of meeting for people across the board who are really frustrated and hurting and need the support of each other. And I think you'll find that after tomorrow, and as we move into the next phase of what's going on in our country, that the cathedral will function for people in a much deeper and more meaningful way.
You know, one of the things we've noticed is that it's a very big doorway for people to enter into a way of thinking about Christ that's surprising. And that's one of the things we're realizing just in putting things online and forming new connections, that we're meeting new people online, and our congregation is, in a way, those geographical barriers have been dissolved a bit by our situation, and it's definitely brought new people into our shared life together, and I'm very grateful for that.
And I think it also gets our ego off the center of things, of thinking that we're part of a much bigger thing, which we're doing things that probably won't come to fruition for 200 years, or that we're working through something that someone had to endure in 1527. But we're much part of a kind of ongoing thing that doesn't last much longer than our lifetime, and therefore we can be humble about it. Yeah. I loved when you quoted Georges Bernanos's Diary of a Country Priest recently. I love that book, and I haven't read it for probably over 60 years ago. And the parish priest is depressed. He's sick himself. He's dying of cancer. He goes through the motions as a priest in the village, and he has an old woman who wasn't very friendly, who's dying, and he goes and gives her the last rites in a kind of perfunctory way, and she dies in peace. And he looks at wonder at the fact that she dies in peace, and he looks at his hands and he says, "The miracle of the empty hands, that you can give to others what you yourself do not possess." Yeah. So don't underestimate what you can do and be in the world. If it seems modest, that's good too.
Yeah, I mean, even when you read the history books about just the conflicts in cathedrals 1,000 years ago, and there's so, I mean, even just the governance, there's chapters and their weekly chapter meetings, and they have conversations about, they don't talk about the boiler because they didn't have boilers, but a lot of conversations that are like that. And it is comforting to see yourself in this long line that will continue long after
bishops weren't allowed in their cathedrals unless they're invited by the dean.
Right.
I taught at Lincoln Theological College for 3 years, and Lincoln Minster was full of history like that.
Oh yeah.
Amazing sort of politics and unworthy things, but nevertheless the vision carried things through into a very, very deep and wonderful place as well.
Looking forward, just from our time, who do you think will be important figures in Christianity from the 20th century and from our time? Will any of them be people who are read, 100 years from now, 200 years from now?
Well, they might not be overtly Christian. There might be stories about the Pope who got himself into trouble. I mean, there might be anecdotes about particular people through a particular event. And I don't know quite how it will shape up. But I think we might realize that those who really had a sense of the transcendent reality of God and the reality of our life together, they were the ones that held the church together in many ways.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is that it makes me realize that people ask me what I am politically, and I say what is it? I say I'm a progressive traditionalist, in that I try and have it both ways, in a sense, and that can frustrate people a bit. In that it depends on the subject. I think when it comes to healthcare, I'm a socialist. When it comes to culture or other ordinary life, I'm probably a libertarian. When it comes to culture itself, I'm a conservative. Mm. So it depends on the subject. And I hate being put into one little corner by people, because I might shock them by saying, well, I'm all over the map when it comes to, and that's why I need a structure of a cathedral and a liturgy. That's why I'm pretty conservative liturgically, because I want at least one thing in my life that doesn't change all the time.
Yeah. What about art in the cathedral? There's so many beautiful things at Grace Cathedral. What are some of your favorite things that are in the cathedral or that are part of the cathedral?
Well, I'm smiling because I was very, very dedicated to having art, and we had some terrible stuff in the cathedral.
Yeah.
Which I won't go into too much.
But I love that too. I mean, that's part of being a public, that's part of opening the doors as wide as you can is taking risks and doing things.
And admitting you don't have to be defensive. You have to say that was a wrong thing to do. That was a mistake.
Yeah,
shouldn't have invited that thing in, or whatever it was. I'm trying to remember.
I love the windows. I mean, we have the window that has the person carrying the Christian Socialist sign.
That's
Walter
right.
Rauschenbusch, I think, is in that mirror, the window. But like the theologians window that has Paul Tillich and Martin Buber and Søren Kierkegaard and John Calvin. I love that little window. I could look at it endlessly, but I don't know what things in there that you love.
There's that window, the final stained glass window we put in, which looks like the figure of cosmic Mary, yes, floating in the universe. That was the last window we put in to complete the whole series, and I love that window very much.
You know what I love about that window is that little lens, so that you can see the sun shining directly through that lens, and you can follow the disc as it goes along the wall. And you can only see it during certain seasons, because when it's winter and the sun is lower on the horizon, it doesn't pass the roof in order to shine on it. But every time I see it, first of all, it reminds you how time is passing. I mean, from the beginning of the sermon to the end of the sermon, that disc is moved.
That's right. Yeah. I think the function of a cathedral in this particular time is important, to be a place of welcome, a place of refuge, a place of contemplation.
Yeah.
That we do that. And that whole notion, I think of the late wonderful Archbishop of Recife in Brazil, Helder Câmara, who was asked about the authority of the bishop. I think I mentioned this to you, that the only authority the bishop has is martyrdom.
Yeah.
And that notion of just being witness and learning what it is to be a witness, and not necessarily winning. It's not a battle of wits. You're not going to argue anyone into this attitude. It's going to be a way of graciously welcoming people into the space. And we have to keep finding different ways to do that. And I tell you one thing I worked through as dean, of realizing the difference between my preferences and my principles. And I often used to confuse my preferences with my principles. And I realized, there's a lot of music I don't like particularly, but I can't object to it because of a principle. It's just a question of taste. And realizing that there's a whole difference between preference and principle was a very helpful distinction as I grew into the role of being dean. It took me a long time.
I feel that very strongly, and just knowing enough about what the cathedral stands for, and letting that be the guide for the decisions that you make, that are many of them on the basis of taste, like you say, in terms of the art exhibits that we have, the music that we provide, the concerts we say yes to. There are a lot of decisions every week about, exactly what grace is going to be.
Yeah. I mean, I think, for example, the building of the labyrinth at the back of the cathedral, which is in the great tradition of Chartres Cathedral and the French cathedrals and the pilgrimage to Jerusalem and so on. But at the same time, you can walk the labyrinth without having to embrace a set of beliefs. Yeah. It's an action. It's a dedication of the self, walking on a journey rather than believing a whole lot of lists of things before you can do anything. And I think that's important for people.
It is, and it's a worldwide movement that started really at Grace Cathedral.
Right. And
Grace and Chartres,
Lauren Artris was a great pioneer in doing that.
The two of you both. I mean, what a blessing that we have both of you still participating in cathedral life. Lauren was here at Grace, just a few weeks ago, and is still very active in everything.
She's great.
It's great to have you there too. Spirituality is your field. And I wonder, a lot of times people have been asking me lately, just, what is prayer and how to pray? And I wonder, when people ask you that question, what do you say to them?
It's a hard one because we live in such a practical society where they want to have a program.
Yeah.
And it's actually sort of, I like the monks who taught me in England, the Anglican monks, who said that prayer is placing yourself every morning on the threshold of death. Doesn't sound very cheering, but it's also an anticipation and a participation in resurrection. So it's placing yourself quietly in a void or an emptiness, which then becomes pregnant with possibility. And to be able to endure sitting alone in a room for a while and not doing anything, but listening and sitting and being still. And I think that is hard to explain because it sounds so unheroic but that's the first thing, rather than babbling on about, a list of things to pray. I remember in the chapel at Murfield where I was trained, the monastic, it had a crucifixion with Sic Deus dilexit mundum, God so loved the world. And that became my prayer for a daily prayer, Sic Deus dilexit mundum, to allow myself to be delighted in, to delight in God, to delight in the world, to sit in a kind of circle of delight. And that became a kind of spirituality and prayer for me. And out of that came particular prayers about praying for people who are sick and people who are suffering and struggling. But the basic thing is not asking for anything, but just resting in the presence of God who made us and who loves us.
Yeah, I like that. I think that there is a way in which a person of prayer, you stop playing the own record of your own life. You begin to see things from more of a detached perspective.
Right.
But I wonder, just after a lifetime of prayer, how much it's changed you over time, or what effect it's had, to put yourself in that silent room.
Well, going through this crisis, I'm very unimpressed by the way I've coped with it. I haven't coped with it terribly well, but I think, how shall I put it? The prayer side of it, let me think for a moment. It's gone out of my head. The process of realizing, I know what I was going to say, that I get bound up with my own narrative, my own psychodrama. And what I love about the gospel and the gospel stories and the prayers and the liturgy and the Eucharist is that it introduces me to a story other than my own little neurotic story. That you tend to think that what you're experiencing is it, rather than what a monk once said to me, just because you've experienced it doesn't mean it really happened. And I think that's a very important distinction, that you get caught up in the interpretation of events. And why being part of a religious community and a prayerful community is that you then get introduced to another way of thinking about things and seeing the world, that vision you have of yourself, which might be depressed and dark, is only one impression, and it isn't the whole truth. And that there's a drama going on other than your own psychodrama. And that is a great liberation in these hard days, as we try and think about civic and civil behavior in a dark and difficult society, where you might just have to rest in silence you may have to go through a kind of crucifixion of your own desires and interpretation of things. And that's a very hard place to be. But the real question is Dante's vision, I come back to Dante a lot, is life is the drama of the soul's choice. We have a choice. We don't have a choice about what happens to us, but we have a choice about how we interpret it and how we live with it. And that's where the freedom of the gospel comes so passionately for us and so resilient in its generosity.
Yeah, there's such a contrast because it's not just an individual like psychodrama. It's almost like we're participating because of Twitter and Facebook and social media and the news cycle. It's almost like there's like almost a shared psychodrama, shared anxiety, and it's such a contrast.
And everyone shares in it and thinks it's the reality.
Yeah, exactly, and thinks it's the only thing there is.
And that's what's so dark about our divisive politics, that each side thinks its vision is the only vision there really is. And this, to be open to other possibilities and other generous visions of things, rather than this sort of tight vision of you're wrong and I'm right. And if you're wrong and I'm right, what is there to talk about? There's nothing to talk about. There's no dialogue. Right. In the beginning was the conversation, forget that. No way, I'm right and you're wrong. So what is there to talk about?
That's why the contrast between, say, reading the New York Times and going to morning prayer at Grace Cathedral, which we now do online. I mean, it's such an extraordinary thing to me, just the contrast between those two different modes of being human. Right. Because you're right, you're immersed in this, in stories that are so much bigger than the stories that are on the front page.
Right.
One of the traditions that you started that we continued online is we do take questions from the audience, and Rebecca gathers up the questions and then sends them to me. So for all our viewers, we'd love to hear your questions. Whatever they are.
You have questions and we have questions.
That's right, exactly. You have questions and we have questions completely. No, not as many answers around here, but we delight to have your questions. So do send them in. Alan, of all the people I know, you're one of the people I know who's thought the most seriously about spiritual direction. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, spiritual direction. And are perspectives changing? I mean, when you were writing about spiritual direction in 1977, how different was it than it is now, where I think more people...
Well, you had a whole Catholic tradition about it, and you could then study it and work with that in the desert tradition. And realizing that we're not alone, we can, it's rather like I started off with the desert tradition, that you go to the master in the desert for advice. I think I told you the story of the man who goes to the guru in the desert and asks for a word. Give me a word, Father. And he says, go to the cemetery and curse the dead. And the young man goes to the cemetery and says, you foul, horrible people. And he swears up and down, and he gets exhausted and finishes cursing the dead. And he goes back to the guru and he said, did you do it? He said, yes, I did. Did they say anything? He said, no. Now go and praise the dead. And he goes, you are greater than the apostles. You're wonderful. And he goes through all this again, and until he's tired of it, and he goes back, and the guru says, did you praise the dead? He said, yes. Did they say anything? He said, no. He said, you have to be as a dead man. You have to be beyond, this kind of worrying about other people's judgment, and realizing you've got a unique spiritual life which you need to nurture and pay attention to. And I think that kind of storytelling and it's actually companionship. Amakitia, friendship. God is friendship. I forget who, my brain is gone. One of the Benedictines said, that's one way of translating God is love, God is friendship.
Yeah. And
that we're born to be related in relation with one another. And that's the tradition of spiritual direction, to make sure people, even if they don't have it formally, at least have a companionship and a person who's walking with them on their journey for a while.
There's so much anxiety and worry about the election tomorrow. And I wonder if you just have any suggestions for what we might do to just kind of find that small, still place and everybody I had contact with today is just like so amped up about their election. And I wonder, what advice you have to just help us to maybe.
Not much advice, but to have, it's one thing, it's very salutary to have a historical imagination. That if you look at human history, upheaval and anxiety are normal, and tranquility is unusual. And that you can't control it, therefore, you have to surrender to the kind of helplessness of it all, that you don't help. Father Jean-Pierre de Caussade, the 17th century mystic in France, had talked about the self-abandonment to the divine providence, which is a big mouthful, about having to surrender to the will of God. And you either do that or you don't do that. But whatever you do, whatever happens tomorrow isn't going to last forever. And you have a choice of either making it worse or making it better, even in your own small way. And so you've got to exercise your choice, even if it's in a small, narrow way, of being a positive influence on the world. And you can do that. I can remember not long ago following a woman in a supermarket with 2 kids in a stroller and looking anxious and awful, and our eyes met, and I smiled and she smiled back, and I realized that was a kind of double gift, that in the middle of all that there was something human, something strong, something good that needed to be celebrated. And that's what we need to search for, and that this isn't going to go on forever.
So one of our questions from a Facebook listener is, have either of you read Miracle of Mindfulness? And the person says, I think it's by Thich Nhat Hanh.
I haven't read it. I know about it, and I'm a great admirer of Thich Nhat Hanh. He came to the cathedral a few times, as did the Dalai Lama. And so I have a great admiration for Thich Nhat Hanh.
Yeah, and I remember reading Skillful Means, and that idea of just skillfulness in human relationships. I found just
one of the things I should tell you about the Dalai Lama was when he visited Grace Cathedral and it was packed, 3,000 people, and he came through the back door, and I was in my robes and went down to meet him, and I tripped and fell on top of him. And I thought, what have I done? And he patted my chest and laughed, and it was such a gracious thing. So I have a great soft spot for the Dalai Lama, for his generous.
I do too. We live in a time with some very extraordinary religious leaders. It's true. Right. So the pandemic, I mean, I a lot of times I think of the pandemic as a process of just unveiling certain truths that we just didn't pay attention to before. I wonder if you ever think in that way. And then when you do, what do you think is being revealed by what's happening with the pandemic?
I think what is being undone, and it's very hard on us, is our rancid individualism. Yeah. And it's pointing out how much we are bound up with one another, the fact of having masks and having social distancing and so on, that we're much more bound up with one another and dependent on one another than we like to think. And we realize we have that whole kind of vision of a kind of selfish, self-centered reality where we all work hard to have more than our neighbor. And we have to recover what it is to be neighbors to one another. And that's a very hard journey, very hard indeed.
It is. We on the first Sunday after shelter in place, Ellen Clark King and I were standing in the vestry, and we had this question. We said, will the pandemic cause people to realize that they don't need church anymore, and then they just won't show up? Or will the pandemic make us so much more aware of how much we need each other and how much we love to be together that it'll actually increase the number of people that are coming? I wonder if you had that thought or want to weigh in on either side.
I think it will reveal our need for community, and then how do you tell stories to maintain that? Otherwise, you can have a tyrannical solution to that. Yeah. So people don't want to think things through, and I think the church offers them a way where you don't close your mind, and certainly don't close your heart, but you are open to things. Otherwise, there will be solutions. I mean, Adolf Hitler saw that the German people needed uniting, and so we will be tempted to have all sorts of dark solutions as well as light ones. And we need to be aware of that. And the church needs to be able to be prepared to stand for an open, healing society.
One of the questions that came in is, can you expand on your earlier comment about transcendence and how it relates to the future of the church?
It's that whole notion of the sense of the sacred, of why we have liturgy and so on, is to have a much broader vision of what it is to be human, rather than just our own local little worries and anxieties and desire for control. And that's what I mean by transcendence, the sense of mystery, the sense of the sacred, which requires discipline and commitment, so that we're not sort of caught and stuck in a kind of narrow, tight little world of our own worry and our own anxiety.
Yeah, that's right. You know, we always have so many young people around Grace Cathedral. It's one of my favorite things about it. I remember telling my wife that I would never want to be associated with a church that didn't have a school, because I get so much life from the young people who I see every day. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what you see as the difference between the spirituality of children and young people versus adult spirituality. You can use examples from your own life or just what you've observed just around.
I think the notion of young people is to develop a safe environment where they can explore and try different things. I mean, it should be a kind of safe place, a place of real safety where they can make mistakes and learn what it is to be forgiven, learn what it is to, as I say, make a mistake, or learning what it is to say you're sorry, and at the same time being creative and open and building things and making things and enjoying. Yeah, I would want to emphasize helping them enjoy each other, and that joyful, that enjoying of each other is a great sort of healing gift for people, I think, and we need more of that. Just that shared joy of radical individualism. Everyone is so radically different, made in the image of God, and yet totally different. That's what I think is so important.
I love the idea of Grace Cathedral as being a place where people enjoy each other. I mean, that's completely, what I miss about Sundays during the pandemic is there's just a little less of that, or maybe it happens online, I guess.
Well,
one of the questions, go ahead.
Go ahead.
It's the question that's coming in, but it'll be not related to what I'm saying now.
That's okay.
Okay, so here's the question. It's a little personal. How has Alan remained physically and mentally well during the pandemic?
Oh.
I would never ask you such a personal question. You know that. I'm
not sure I have.
That's what I was wondering.
Trying to do walking the dog. The dog is my spiritual director. I've learned a lot from this funny little creature. And also going, having a little small disciplines like going for walks and so on. But I have to say, and I don't want to say too much because I don't want to be too personal, but I haven't been very impressed with the way I've coped with it. I'm a bit fed up with, when I say to cricket, what shall we do today? And we say, oh, we could do what we did yesterday. It's very difficult to have a fresh and new vision of things and to live gratefully. So 3 things. I try and have 3 little commands. One is be amazed. And I'm not always good at that. I'm sort of fed up with it. It doesn't seem amazing to me that these people are still walking around and, So be amazed, be grateful, and be kind. I still think of Houston Smith talking about when he was a student, I think at Syracuse University or there somewhere, and he was designated to drive Aldous Huxley back to the airport. And he had the gall to ask Aldous Huxley if he had any regrets. Very cheeky thing for a young student to ask Aldous Huxley.
Houston was brave like that from the time he was young. He went all the way till his death. He was like
Anyway,
that.
Huxley said, yes, I wish I'd been more kind.
Ah,
And I think that is, I try and understand that in everyone I meet, and to try and see that unique instance of what it is to be human and to be as generous as I possibly can in terms of judgment.
yeah.
But I'm not, I have to say, I don't think I'm very good at it yet.
You know, I think part of the coronavirus experience is that we've just all had our better and worse moments. And one of the main things I just try to communicate with people is that anything you plan, anything you do, anything you say, COVID will throw a wrench into it.
Right.
You just have to realize that's going to happen and just be.
I feel ashamed that I think, you know, people who think that wearing a mask is encroaching on their freedom are deeply stupid.
Yeah.
So I have to watch my judgmentalism, that we live in a culture that is deeply, deeply, deeply stupid and confuses freedom with doing what you damn well please.
Yeah.
That's when I get all het up, and I need to sort of calm down and ask forgiveness myself.
Yeah. It was hard. I mean, there were a lot of moments where just things that are just normal health directives became political.
I know we wear seatbelts.
Yeah.
You know,
Like
we have
unnecessary.
driver's licenses.
Yeah.
This notion of freedom is just, and having a gun. It's our gun culture.
Yeah.
So I've got to watch not going down that path of indignation. I'm very good at being indignant.
As we all are. So one of the questions we have from one of our viewers is, could you expand on the idea of rancid individualism?
Yes, that whole notion that the doctrine, instead of the idea of community, that the vision of a human being is an isolated individual with no reference to other people at all. And when that happens, then things go sour inside us. And we get more and more lonely and more angry and more indignant. And that's what I meant. I like the word rancid because it suggests something going bad inside us.
Yeah, I like that too. Something that was originally good.
Yeah. Well, I think the Christianity actually has a great conversation between the difference between being an individual and being a person. And being a person was to share in the whole life of God. Whereas individuals is like a pizza. You cut up the pizza, and I'm already in competition with you because I want a bigger piece than you have.
Yeah.
Whereas a person is an individual instance of the whole pizza, that we're not enemies of or rivals of one another at all. And it's when we're made rivals of one another when I better get as much as I can so that I can survive, rather than what it might be to share things. And that's a hard journey to embark upon, because as I say, I get my indignation up sometimes.
Was there anything that you learned from your predecessors, the former deans, that you would want to pass on, or that you can think of? I mean, the answer can be just no, I can't think of anything from the former deans, but I've always wanted to ask you that question. I'm
smiling because I wouldn't presume, because I realize how hard it is to be dean. It's not an easy
role.
Journey. So I'm very tender about that. I think it was Charles Williams who used to sign all his letters, finish his letters with "under the mercy." And what I realized in being dean was what it is to be under the mercy of God. And I hope that people will forgive me for not being a good dean all the time or making mistakes, but people will be generous in their interpretation of what I tried to do.
Yeah.
And I, in my turn, will place myself under the mercy of God.
And honestly, everyone in everyone's vocation, we're all under that same mercy. That's a good reminder, definitely.
You know,
usually we ask our guests for if they see any signs of hope, but we're completely out of time. But do you see any signs of hope that you want to share with us before we close?
The fact that we're alive and you and I are having this conversation, there's lots to hope for. And there's children, and there's fun, and there's people with creativity. And there are many, many stories. Do not allow the dark story that it possesses you to be the only story. You may have to admit to it and live in it, but it's not the only. There's a story going on other than your own psychodrama. And that's what I would like you to get outside your own particular narrow story and live more generously as you possibly can. And you will change lives, and you will change your life, and you will change the lives of others.
It was such a blessing to be able to preach at your 80th birthday, Alan. And I wish I'd had this conversation before I wrote the sermon, because you're right.
It was lovely. Yeah, it's been a long time. That 80th birthday was March the 5th, and then after that, clunk.
That was the last time I had an hors d'oeuvre.
Those were the days.
That was a magical night. And even as it was happening, we all had a sense that something big was looming. And I think we really enjoyed that moment. You know, the cathedral was beautiful, and it was so good to see so many friends there. To me, it's the bright light that we had before everything happened with
you just think what it was like before the cathedral was there, and what it was to build it and to raise the money for it, and to what vision and what hard work, and what wonderful people our predecessors were, who worked so hard and so generously to make that beautiful space. I mean, when we had 9/11 and 14,000 people passed through Grace Cathedral, it was a way of a sacred space to heal people, and that's what it will do again.
Yeah. Exactly. Many more times.
Yeah.
I wanted to announce, please join me next week. After the election, we'll be enjoying our guest, Mayor London Breed. We'll be talking about the city of San Francisco after the election and after the pandemic. You can help us bring the arts to life at Grace Cathedral with a gift to the forum. Please visit gracecathedral.org/give to Grace. And Alan, one of my greatest things that I give thanks for is your ministry to us, and your care for us, and your thoughtfulness, and just what you've taught us with your life. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, and being so generous in all that you do, and all that you give to Grace Cathedral.
Well, thanks for having me. It's been a great journey.
Yes.
It's not quite over yet, but it's coming. It's coming.
I was going to ask you all these questions about that too, but we'll have to do that next time. When we get together in person, next time in Jerusalem.
That's right. Next time in Jerusalem. Exactly.
Thanks for watching, everybody, and good night.
Good night.